When Paul wrote Romans, if you were to open up the book of Romans, Rick, is that you back? Where's Rick? Rick, are you in the room? He's back there. Okay, so you guys taught through Romans, didn't you? How long did it take you? 18 months it took. I'm not kidding you. They were back there, and if you're looking for a Bible study and evenings are hard, Rick and I think Bob can jump in there too at times. They do a Bible study back here at 9 o'clock that's very in-depth and very good, and Rick's an amazing teacher and extremely bright. But they did 18 months in the book of Romans. If you were to read Romans, even sit down and read it, you will get bogged down fast because it is just pure theology. Why is that? Because Paul didn't know the folks in Rome. He didn't have a relationship with them like he does in Corinth. When Paul writes a letter to a church, to Corinth, to Philippi, to Thessalonica, to the folks in Rome, you got to understand that back then, if someone was to write a letter to the church of Anthem, there would be lots of different churches. But back then, it was the church of Corinth. Some of you have been to Ephesus like I have, or Corinth, and you see the ancient city, and it's fun to walk through, particularly Ephesus, because it's so massive, and you can still see where houses were, and where people were, and where the roads were. And so if somebody says that they wrote a letter to Corinth, to the Christians, to the saints, to the followers of Jesus in Corinth, they're writing a letter to all the Christians in that town. And so when he wrote to Rome, he didn't know them. He didn't know the problems. I'm sure they had their issues, but he didn't know them. But here in Corinth, something interesting is happening. This is actually a response from a letter that he got. And so the pastors and the leaders of that church are going, we have a complete mess on our hands. And we don't, God bless both of you at the same time. That was like in stereo. That was sweet. So he writes this, he gets this letter, and it says, listen, we've got ourselves some problems. And he starts naming them. So Paul turns around and he writes, because he spent time there. And he writes a letter to them. And unlike in Rome, where it's a deep theological discourse, it's actually the opposite, and it's very practical. And he deals with things that are happening real time in that church. In fact, turn to Acts chapter 18. In Acts 18, we learn about the visit that he had. I mean, this relationship that he started with the good people in Corinth. And kind of gives us a baseline and understanding of what happened and how it all happened. And in verse 1, it says this in Acts 18:1, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. Now, I think I have a map. Rick, do I have a map up there anywhere? So can you even see that? It's screenshot. Come on up here, everyone, just kind of. So over here you see Ephesus. I talked about Ephesus, and that's actually in modern-day Turkey. And so it's the Western Turkey, and if you ever have a chance to go there, Western Turkey is very safe versus Eastern Turkey is not so. There's some issues there. It's very safe over here, and you can see that there's a long distance. But over here, Athens, and that distance between Athens and Corinth is only about an hour drive. That bus drive from Athens to Corinth is a beautiful ride. And so he spends some time, and on his journey, on his missionary journey, he makes these stops. And he leaves Athens, and he goes to Corinth, and he spends some time there. He really likes these people. And we keep going. So verse 3, it says, he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently came from Italy with his wife Priscilla. Now, they got kicked out of Rome for their faith, and so they ended up in the town of Corinth. Because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, and when he went to see them, and because he was at the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. So we've got this picture of Paul shows up, and he's got to work, and so he lives with this couple in their home, and they're tent makers. And so he works by day, Monday through Friday, but in evenings and weekends he heads to the synagogue and he starts talking about faith and he talks about Christ. In fact, there's this theme all through 1 Corinthians regarding the resurrection. He keeps bringing them back over and over and over about the resurrection of Jesus, because everything's based on that resurrection. And so he's sitting there and he's talking and he's getting to know them and he's building relationship, and we think he's there for about a year and a half. So when these things start arising and issues start popping up in the church, within people, whether it's division or issues, they know that he knows those folks by name. And it would be like one of us writing a letter to someone who had been here for a long time and going, you know what, do you remember this person? Well, this person's doing this and this person's doing that. And they would be able to identify not just issues, but people or personalities or characteristics. And so for this first week of kind of introduction and background, there's some boring things that we need to take care of, but they're a foundation. If you don't understand these, some of the things that we discuss may not make a whole lot of sense. And the first thing, if you're taking notes, is that the Church of Corinth and today's Western church share many similarities. There were Romans, there were Greeks, there were Jews. They're about somewhere between 100, I know it's kind of crazy that they couldn't narrow it down more than this, but somewhere between 100,000 and 600,000 people. So regardless, there were an awful lot of people. And it was very diverse. And so you name the people. In fact, if you were to see that map, or if you were to go there, the distance between Corinth and the ocean is probably, 15 miles. And you're like, how can it be a port? But back then, it was a port, and the water was higher. And I don't know how all of that works, and I'm not pretending to know, but it's all dry land now, and it's this huge distance between them and the ocean. And it was a port, and it was one of the biggest ports. And so there's some things that you need to know. First of all, is they were very intellectually alert. They were not only intellectually alert, but they were materialistically prosperous and morally corrupt. And when I discovered those terms, at that point I realized this is for us. This similarity between Corinth and what we live in today there's just too many similarities. And Corinth was extremely prosperous in Greece. Athens, more so in some ways, but this was a major port. And as people made their way in and around and doing business, everyone made their way to Corinth. It'd be like on the East Coast that, Boston's one thing and Fort Lauderdale, or you go down the coast, but New York and D.C., but New York City, that's still the center, and it was the center of the time. Which leads us to number 2, and that is they were unashamed. Immorality and corruption was rampant. Rampant. And there was a clear, gross, sinful atmosphere which continued even to make its mark into the church. Many of the problems of the church found basis in the city. In fact, every night, some would say that 1,000 prostitutes would go to the temple. And they would do what prostitutes do, particularly because of the ships that came in and all the sailors. And the money that was raised went to the upkeep of the city and went to the idols. It was unbelievably grotesque. And what's interesting is that no one thought a thing about it. And I think about the things that we just accept today. And it'd be really easy at this point to sound like a 1955 Baptist preacher with sawdust on the floor and a tent overhead. But there's something about that message that's been lost in the last 50 years. And this is where prayer comes in. In no way do I want to be preaching against people. In fact, to be totally honest, I don't even want to preach against sin. I just want to preach for the life found in Jesus. Because when I discover, and when you discover the life that's available in the person of Christ, the sin becomes so obvious in the life of a believer that it actually becomes grotesque. Now, we'll hit those, and I will preach it. If it's in the text, I will preach it. Some passages of the Bible I'm not thrilled about. But I think about the issues of idolatry then, and I think we have our version of idolatry today. Do you think it's crept into the church? Afraid you might be right. Number 3, unlike some of the letters, Paul knew these folks by name. Touched on this already. The very relationship that he had with them for that year and a half was one that he utilized in writing this letter. Paul's ministry in Corinth was fruitful and extended. He remained there for a subsequent amount of time, but to build relationship and to know the actual issues of what they were dealing with at the time and what they were going through. And the situation in Corinth did not clear up after the writing of this first letter either, which I think is fascinating. Do you ever wonder, like if, it's probably just me, but what if Billy Graham was still alive? And you think, man, what this town needs is Billy Graham or Luis Palau or the harvest guy, what's his name, Greg Laurie. And we need to have someone come in, and we need to have their whole entourage come and set up camp and preach, and revival would come. And what we need is that we need the preacher to preach against sin, and he needs to preach from this particular version of the Bible, and they need to do less music or more music, or they need to do more preaching or this kind of preaching. They need to have a conference, and everyone needs to go to this particular conference, and all of us have this different ideas of what this world or what the church might need. And what I found to be fascinating is here's Paul himself, who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament, who came and met with them and knew them and ate with them and debated with them in the synagogue and had relationship with each of them, knew each of them by name. Not only the people in the church, but the people in the community and the government. And then he goes and he writes this long letter naming people and issues. And it's delivered, and they stand and they read it and they open it up and they unveil Paul's words from God to the church. And instead of hearing da 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 da, it's wah wah wah. Like, what? You know what's disappointing? It's disappointing and it's life-giving, all at the exact same time. That your life and my life will never change unless there is a submission to the gospel of Christ and an understanding that life and change and fruit comes directly from the work of the Holy Spirit. And I just wish I had more control. I mean, I have control of my life. There's a passage of the Bible that I'm kind of hit a little bit early here. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 11. It's at the very end of the presentation. I'm going to have to skip you in the back there, Rick. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 11 says this. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. But later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. In the next few weeks, it is highly likely, that there's going to be a passage of Scripture or two or more that is going to rub you completely the wrong way. It's like petting a cat the wrong direction. And it'll be your responsibility and mine to respond appropriately. For the moment, all discipline seems painful at the moment. He hits them all. I'm going to skip ahead here. Divorce, remarriage, singleness, sexual immorality, gender roles in worship. Oh, we shouldn't have any problem there. Order in worship, the right use of spiritual gifts such as speaking in tongues and prophecy. Christian freedoms, conflict, divisions, quarrels. The significance of the Lord's Supper. The right and wrong way to resolve legal issues with Christians, as Christians. That's just a few. I know. What was I thinking? Are we in number 6? Anyone taking notes? 4? Thank you. You're my favorite. Paul's letter was a response to a letter they wrote to him, basically asking advice. What do we do? We got our hands full. We got a mess on our hands. Number 5, as practical as the letter is, the resurrection of Jesus was still at the center of the message. I love this. The letter opens with a celebration of the cross, closes with an emphasis on Christ's resurrection, and repeatedly presents Christ as the gospel as the essence of Paul's preaching. Let me just tell you this, that song that Jeremy and Janelle and Mike led us in, what was that one, the one that I liked, the gospel? Sorry? Praise the name. That's the message. But it's not just the message of this series, it's the message of this church. Do you realize how easy it is to be sidetracked away from the message of the gospel of Christ? Do you understand how easy it is to slip into, and I don't want to say like it's all bad, and there's times that we want to help folks with practical ideas on how to live and communicate better in marriages. But if our central message of the church, and we don't hit it, come back to it often, isn't the gospel of Jesus, then we are a really, really good conference center for the week. And I know that it's difficult when you haven't embraced it and you haven't lived it and you haven't seen the fruit of it in your life. And I understand that it might be foreign, but let me just invite you that all you and I need is the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and embrace it in our life, because in that he provides life in ways that's unavailable in any other way. And it's tempting that even for me, if someone comes in my office and they have issues, and I immediately think, well, maybe they need to go to a Christian counselor. And I'm all in favor of Christian counseling. 30 years ago, it did an amazing thing in my life, and I recommend counseling, and I'm not against counseling. But outside of the resurrection, there are things that are good. There are books that we can read. There are conferences that we can go to. But at the core, if you've never experienced the resurrection of Christ in your life, it's all going to end up empty. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. But later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Hey, would you do yourself a favor? Would you commit the next 20 weeks with me? Whether you're one of my prayers or not, that's irrelevant. That's God, if he hears 10 of us or if he hears 100 of us, he's going to hear somebody. But would you commit the next 20 weeks to be a part of this series? And don't look ahead to the next chapter and go, oh, that's not for me. Or here's the other tempting one. Read the next chapter and go, oh, I know the guy that needs to hear this. And think, boy, I'm going to take him to lunch afterwards. The pagan needs to hear that message. You know the pagan that I'm concerned about? This one. And you know the pagan you should be worried about? That one. The next 20 weeks. We have it online. You can go on our website. If you miss a week, you can watch it. You think I'm pretty here. I'm a lot prettier even on TV. Be a part of the series. Be a part of what God might have. And resist the temptation of going, I don't know if I want to hear that one. Come. This is why. Because it may be painful at the moment, but it yields peaceful fruit of righteousness in the end. In the end. Jeremy, you know that one song that we just spoke of? Can you lead us in that? You're gonna sing this. You're gonna sing it. So how many sang real loud when we first sang? To 3 of you. So I'm going to ask all of us to just sing as loud as you can and listen to these words and let them come from your hearts. And let's allow the gospel to start right here and right now to penetrate our hearts. I'm thrilled for you. God has something special for each of us, no matter who you are, where you are in your walk of life. Whatever your walk with Jesus is today, it doesn't matter. I know that God has something planned for you. Let me pray for you. God, thank you for being in control of this church and this sermon, this worship, our lives, our families, our health, our finances. There are things happening in our lives that are way bigger than us, and we just plop them at your feet. And just as Paul wrote this letter to the church of Corinth, God, there's so much, as if this letter was just written to the Western church today. And may we be open to it personally, and where the application and change be personal. Thank you for Jesus, who came, who lived, who died, who was buried, and rose again. And we're going to sing it.